Hey, thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you're not yet, please subscribe and share this episode or podcast with a friend. It's always amazed me how little we speak militarily of the Indian subcontinent in terms of its consequence over 2 centuries during the modern era of colonial expansion. The battles that won India for Britain are simply some of the most critical of our time. Without India's immense wealth and resources, the British Empire would never have ascended to its dominant position on the world stage. India's vast revenues funded Britain's military campaigns. They underpinned its naval supremacy and fueled its industrial revolution. The absence of this critical colony would have left Britain unable to compete with other European powers such as France or Spain, whose imperial ambitions would have gone unchecked. As Lord Curzon famously warned, quote, "As long as we rule India, we are the greatest power in the world. If we lose it, we shall drop straight away to a third-rate power," end quote. Let's now experience this fulcrum battle of the Indian subcontinent at the Battle of Plassey.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 45, The Battle of Plassey, the 23rd of June, 1757. English forces, 1,000 Brits, 2,100 Indians, and 100 gunners with 8 cannon. Indian and French forces, 15,000 cavalry, 35,000 infantry, 10,000 militia-men, and 53 cannon. The British triumph at Plassey not only cemented English control over Bengal, but set in motion the complete subjugation of India, the wealth of which fueled Britain's ascent to global imperial supremacy, being unmatched as a superpower for generations.
The 18th century in India was a seething cauldron of power struggles, where ancient empires tottered and foreign ambitions took root. Within its own borders, the once dominant Mughal Empire was splintering, its throne occupied by feeble kings, while ambitious nobles tore at its foundation. Delhi remained the nominal seat of imperial power, but the true rulers of the land were the Nawabs, local princes who governed their territories with impunity, bending to or defying the emperor's will as it suited their own designs. Into this chaotic landscape strode the French and the British, opportunistic forces eager to carve their place amidst India's crumbling order. The British presence was spearheaded by the Honourable East India Company, whose trading outposts, Calcutta in the northeast, Madras in the southeast, and Bombay in the northwest, were more than commercial hubs. They were footholds of imperial ambition. The French established their own bastion of influence in Pondicherry, just a stone's throw from British Madras, setting the stage for a deadly rivalry. Both European powers, under the guise of trade, sought alliances with the local Nawabs, each hoping to mold the political chaos in their favor, shaping the uncertain future that would emerge from the ashes of the eventual Mughal collapse. As was inevitable, the enmity between England and France on the battlefields of Europe spilled into India, where each backed opposing Nawabs in a proxy war for dominance. The Indian rulers, however, regarded these European interlopers with mixed feelings, unsure whether to embrace them as useful allies or dismiss them as foreign nuisances. While the trade wealth was welcome, it was the foreign military prowess that truly caught the eye of the Nawabs, for in these guns and disciplined battalions lay the promise of tipping the ever-shifting balance of power in India. Yet many Nawabs scorned the Europeans as little more than uncultured opportunists, only to discover with growing disdain that the Europeans held them in equal contempt. Nowhere was this contempt more apparent than in the heart of Suraj-ud-Dawla, the powerful Nawab of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, whose hatred for the British burned like a fever. Suraj-ud-Dawla's loathing for the British knew no bounds. He was determined to drive them from Calcutta, not only fearing their designs on his lands, but convinced they hoarded untold wealth behind the walls of Fort William. In 1756, with an army of 50,000 men at his back, Suraj-ud-Dawla unleashed his fury upon Calcutta, where a mere 515 defenders, half of them European, stood against the onslaught. The defense crumbled quickly, and the British officials fled, abandoning 170 soldiers to face the inevitable death that followed them. Of the captured, 146 were crammed into a suffocating cell, an 18-foot square with a single window, an iron box of despair. By dawn, only 23 men stumbled out alive. The survivors of the hellish ordeal, forever known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Word of this atrocity reached Madras, and Robert Clive, a man of cold resolve, was dispatched without hesitation to reclaim Calcutta. Clive had first set foot in India as a mere clerk in 1744, just an 18-year-old in the employ of the East India Company. But war would soon reveal Clive's true nature. In 1751, amidst the simmering conflict with the French near Potengary, he convinced his superiors to strike at Arcot, the regional capital, proving that he was born not for ledgers, but for command. Incredibly, despite having no formal military training, Clive was handed command of the operation, as if destiny itself demanded his rise from the ranks of the unknown. Leading only a few hundred men, Clive seized the city, and then held it through a brutal 50-day siege against a combined force of French and Indian troops. These bold deeds, along with others, marked him as a hero in England, showering him with rewards and promotions. By the time Clive returned to India in 1756, he had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the regular army, commanding soldiers sent to reinforce the company's private army in the ever-growing theater of war. The triumph at Arcot had secured Clive's reputation, making him the obvious choice to spearhead the company's efforts to reclaim Bengal. Calcutta clings to the banks of the Hooghly River, where its waters break southward from the Ganges, cutting a path toward the distant Indian Ocean some 200 miles away. Fulta, near the river's mouth, became a refuge for the British officials who had fled Calcutta, stranded and humiliated by their retreat. Clive arrived with 900 hardened Europeans and 1,500 Indian Sepoys, sweeping in to rescue the disgraced officials and set the stage for a brutal counterstrike. Without hesitation, Clive launched his assault, and by the 2nd of January 1757, the British flag once again flew over Calcutta, wrested back from Suraj-ud-Dowla's grip. Following an inconclusive skirmish in February, Clive forced Suraj-ud-Dowla into a reluctant peace. The British were permitted to reoccupy Calcutta, and the company extracted reparations for the humiliations and losses they had endured. Clive harbored no illusions about the treaty's permanence. It was a pause, not a resolution, and the storm clouds were already gathering. Clive soon caught wind of the treacherous whispers in Suraj-ud-Dowla's court, and he wasted no time in probing deeper into these intrigues. Sensing an opportunity, Clive set his sights on Mir Jafar, Suraj-ud-Dowla's own uncle, plotting to use him as the key to overthrow the Nawab. Meanwhile, Suraj-ud-Dowla maintained ties with the French, foolishly insisting that the British and French abstain from fighting in India, even as the flames of the 7 Years' War raged across Europe. Clive sought not only to dismantle French influence in Bengal, but also to bring down the man whose name had become synonymous with the Black Hole atrocity. As Clive skillfully maneuvered behind the scenes with Mir Jafar, the British struck swiftly, seizing a French outpost mere miles from Murshidabad, Suraj-ud-Dowla's seat of power. The brazen assault, combined with impossible demands from the British, provoked Suraj-ud-Dowla's wrath. The Nawab raised yet another army and marched with fury toward Calcutta, determined to crush his foes. His army, a juggernaut of 60,000 men, descended upon Calcutta, bolstered by 53 artillery pieces, manned by skilled French gunners, ready to obliterate the British. Fort William stood as a decent defensive option, but Clive was not one to sit behind walls. His instinct was to strike first, to take the fight to the enemy. The odds, however, were staggering. Clive could only muster 3,000 infantry, of which barely a third were European, with a paltry 8 light cannons and 2 howitzers to face the massive Indian force. The 20-1 odds bordered on madness, and for a fleeting moment, even Clive's legendary confidence faltered. But secret messages from Mir Jafar brought a lifeline. Jafar promised to hold back his forces when the battle began, and at the decisive moment, would turn on his own side to aid the British. Clive, appearing to be a gambler in warfare, pinned his hopes on Jafar's betrayal and steeled himself for the coming clash. On the night of June 22nd, Clive and his men bivouacked in a mango grove by the Hooghly River, just north of the small town of Plassey, soon to be etched in British history as Plassey. As dawn broke the following day, the French gunners unleashed a thunderous barrage, signaling the opening salvo of what would become the Battle of Plassey. Yet the French barrage struck mostly air, for Clive had cleverly positioned his men on the far side of a hill, their lines shielded from incoming fire. The Indian army encircled Clive's force in a vast crescent, their numbers daunting, with the center held by Mir Muddin Khan, Suraj-ud-Dowlah's most formidable general. Clive's artillery, though vastly outnumbered, tore into the exposed ranks of the Indian soldiers, and for hours the battle devolved into a bloody artillery duel. At noon, the heavens opened in a monsoon downpour, drenching the battlefield and rendering the French gunpowder sodden and useless. Believing the British to be equally crippled by the rain, Mir Muddin Khan gave the order for a full-scale assault. But Clive had prepared for just such a moment. He recalled the old wisdom of Cromwell, quote, "Trust in God, but keep your powder dry," end quote. His men had shielded their powder from the storm, and as Mir Muddin's forces charged, Clive's cannons roared to life, ready to greet them with a wall of fire. As the enemy surged across the open ground, they were met with a withering barrage. Wave after wave of infantry fell under the relentless fire, and even Mir Muddin Khan himself was cut down in the chaos. Confusion and terror spread through the Indian ranks, and they began to retreat, reeling from the ferocity of the British counterattack. Fortune favored Clive, as Mir Jafar remained true to his promise, holding his force of 45,000 men back from the fray, watching the carnage from the sidelines. Upon witnessing Jafar's betrayal and receiving word that his best general, Mir Muddin Khan, had fallen, Suraj-ud-Dowlah's nerves shattered. He abandoned the field, fleeing with a bodyguard of 2,000 men toward his capital. In his panic, Suraj-ud-Dowlah issued orders for a full retreat, but confusion reigned in the battle, and many of his soldiers never received the command, fighting on in disarray. Seizing the moment of confusion, Clive unleashed one final devastating barrage before commanding his troops to advance, sweeping the field. Clive's men surged forward, cutting through the remaining Indian troops and overrunning the French artillery positions, crushing the last pockets of resistance. By 5 p.m., the dust of battle had settled, and Clive stood victorious, his triumph at Plassey complete. With just 23 dead and 49 wounded, Clive had secured one of the most extraordinary victories in military history, an achievement that would echo through the ages. Suraj-ud-Dowlah's army suffered 1,000 casualties, a devastating blow made all the worse by the fact that 3/4 of his forces, held back by Mir Jafar, had never even entered the fight. 1 in 15 of those who fought was killed or wounded. Above all, it was Suraj-ud-Dowlah's craven flight that sealed the fate of his army. Yet, had Mir Jafar broken his pact with Clive, the British might have been crushed beneath the sheer weight of the enemy's numbers. A few days after his ignoble retreat, Suraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and swiftly executed. In his place, Mir Jafar ascended as the new Nawab, his treachery rewarded with a throne. Clive, however, harbored no illusions about Jafar's loyalty. He knew the Nawab understood that his throne rested solely on British support, and only through that alliance could he hope to maintain his rule. For a brief time, Jafar feared that Clive might withhold the throne, as he had not fought alongside the British, but instead stood aloof from the battle as a passive conspirator. But when Clive kept his promise, Jafar responded in kind, bestowing upon him a staggering gift of 160,000 pounds. Clive's officers too shared in the spoils, each receiving generous sums for their part in the victory. Though an extravagant fortune by any measure, especially at that time, such lavish gifts were hardly out of the place in dealings of the time. Indeed, many East India Company officials returned to England with riches beyond imagination, their coffers overflowing from such rewards. Clive, in turn, proved a reliable ally. Appointed governor of Bengal by London, he swiftly crushed several uprisings against Jafar's rule and shielded him from the predatory ambitions of neighboring princes. When Clive at last departed India in 1760, he was only 35 years old, yet already a legend of empire and conquest. Far more significant than Clive's personal triumph was the battle's enduring impact on the East India Company and, by extension, the British Empire itself. Plassey cemented British dominance in Bengal, securing their grip on the vital port of Calcutta, a gateway to the lucrative trade routes that sustained the East India Company's wealth in India. As a further prize, Mir Jafar granted the company zamindar rights over the land surrounding Calcutta, bestowing upon them not just economic, but political control over the region. With these rights, the East India Company became de facto landlords, empowered to collect not only rents, but more crucially, taxes from the local populace. No longer content with mere economic supremacy, the company began to wield political authority as well, imposing its will directly upon the people of Bengal. What set the British apart, however, was not their collection of taxes, but the fact that they did so with a fairness previously unseen in Indian governance. This unexpected sense of justice won the British an unlikely respect, and soon the Bengalis began to see them as fair rulers and willing protectors in an otherwise turbulent land. The stability forged in Bengal became the foundation upon which the British would replicate their administration across their trading outposts, eventually extending their reach across the entire subcontinent. While the British often ruled with an imperious and condescending hand, their governance was, in many cases, more just than an arbitrary rule of the native princes. Plassey's victory crowned Britain as the undisputed European power in India, overshadowing all other colonial competitors. Though Britain continued to clash with the French forces for a few more years, the French's defeat in the 7 Years' War and their failure to hold ground in India sealed their fate. Within 2 decades, they withdrew entirely from their colonial ambitions on the subcontinent. With the French out of the picture and the Dutch in decline, the East India Company found itself without serious rivals, free to expand its dominion unhindered. In the wake of these victories, British influence, its power, its wealth, and social order spread across the vast expanse of India. When the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 finally forced the East India Company to disband, the British government stepped in, establishing formal colonial rule over India, solidifying their grip on the jewel of their empire. By then, India had long been recognized as the crown jewel of the British Empire, a status it maintained until the subcontinent finally won its independence in 1948. The torrents of wealth that poured out of India after 1757 transformed England into the richest nation on earth, just as the riches of the Americas had once made Spain the envy of the world. For 2 centuries after Plassey, England siphoned India's wealth, leveraged its strategic position on the global stage, and called upon its soldiers in times of war. In these roles, India responded, and the British Empire imperially ruled through its colonial holdings worldwide.